Awesome. I know it's 2:30. Everyone just had a big lunch, and I'm probably going to see a lot of droopy eyes. So I'll try to keep you guys awake for 25 minutes. So today my talk is about Redux versus Mobx and comparing the opposing paradigms. And I know we have a bunch of front-end devs that are probably sitting there going, ooh, yeah, I'm ready for this battle. So I'm curious, in the audience, if you're bold enough to shout it out or raise your hand, who would say, I would definitely pick Redux over Mobx? And who would say they'd definitely pick Mobx over Redux? Yeah! All right, and who's ready for the right answer? That's the right answer. Like most things in software engineering, everything is based on opinions and trade-offs and not facts and hard truths, right? So, but going between the previous slide and this one, I think there's a lot we can learn by comparing the opposing paradigms and talking about the benefits, the trade-offs, and I think the goal for this today's talk is to for me to share my own mental model for how I look at these opposing paradigms. And if you disagree with my mental model, that's totally fine, but the goal is to kind of have like an intellectual discussion, and hopefully you'll walk away with a good idea of how you can think about comparing the two libraries. So, to get started about me quickly, I'm a co-founder and lead engineer at a company called Sapien.ai. We just started. We're kind of building Siri for brands. And things I live for, I love learning about code, teaching about code, writing about code. Some of you may have read any of my Medium posts. I'm obsessed with physical training and fitness. I do like TRX and CrossFit and stuff like that. I'm obsessed with food. I probably can eat more food than most of you guys out there. I love wine and whiskey, and I live to make a positive impact in this world. So the goals for this talk are, one, quickly explore the differences between the two in case some people haven't used both. And then we're going to spend a bulk of the time evaluating the benefits and trade-offs of the two opposing paradigms. And then we're going to close off by talking about how do you even go about choosing between, plain React, Mobx, Redux, or something else altogether. So Mobx and Redux, they're both open source client-side state management libraries. They basically describe UI as a function of state. And they really have no relation to React. Like you can use it with Ember, jQuery, but they do work really well with React. So React provides mechanisms to optimally render UI by using virtual DOM, and Mobx and Redux provide the mechanisms to synchronize your application state with your React components. So quickly going through the differences. But first, let me explain. So Redux is kind of like a derivation of the Flux architecture. So if you remember Flux kind of came out with the one-way data flow. Something happens in the view propagates an action, and then the action gets sent to the store via callback that the store registers with the dispatcher, and then the store emits a change once it updates its state. And Redux follows a similar paradigm with one-way data flow and actions firing, except there's three main differences. One is that there's a single store, so your state is stored in one giant JavaScript object. Two is, unlike Flux, Redux doesn't have the concept of a dispatcher because it instead uses pure functions instead of a dispatcher. And third, in Redux, your store is immutable, so your state is one giant JavaScript object that's immutable. Mobx, this is how I kind of view Mobx. So I think to explain Mobx on a high level, at a high level, you can think of it in terms of a paradigm of spreadsheets. So you have what I call your observable values, which is what your state is. And what Mobx does is it wraps your data in observables, so it gives your data observable capabilities. And you can think of that as your data cells in a spreadsheet. And then you have what are called derivations. And there's two types of derivations. There's computed values, which are pure functions that derive state off your observable data. And then you can think of your computed values as formulas in a spreadsheet. So if you have two columns of data, which are your observable data, and a third column multiplying the two columns, that's your formula, that's your computed value. And then you have reactions, which are similar to computed values, but instead of producing a new value, they produce a side effect. So you can think of it as like you're taking the output of the formula and drawing it to the screen. So the main differences that I'm going to talk about in this section is these four. So I'm going to quickly go through that. So as I said, with Redux, you always have a single store. With Mobx, you typically have more than one store. And so yeah, with Mobx, you can separate your app into different modules or entities, and sorry, something's going on. With Mobx, you can separate your app into different modules or entities, and each domain class kind of encapsulates its own data and logic. And usually you have like at least two stores, one for the UI and one for your domain state. But really, how you structure your store is really up to you. Maybe you decide to put your users and messages all in one store because there's some containment logic or something, but that's kind of left up to you. So that's one main difference. Second is, obviously, one uses plain data structures, the other uses observable data. So Redux uses plain JavaScript objects and arrays and structures. Mobx wraps your regular JavaScript object with observable capabilities. And so what this allows is that even though it feels like you're working with JavaScript objects, under the hood, they're using observables, so it can automatically track changes through implicit subscriptions. And how Mobx works is it observes references. So let's say you have an observable object, it has an ID and name. Any observable property that's dereferenced or dotted into an attract function will be recorded. An attract function is something like a computed value or a reaction. So it basically keeps track of the data that you care about, because usually the computed values and the reactions are the data that you're dereferencing and caring about. So it won't track things that are not in tracked functions, or it won't track things that are read in an asynchronously invoked code block. So overall, the way to think about it is with Redux, you're manually tracking updates. It's more explicit and passive. Mobx, because it uses observables, it's automatically tracking updates. It's implicit through implicit subscriptions, and it's reactive. This is an easy one. With Redux, your state is read-only, as I said. You take your previous state, action, and you always produce a new state, so everything is pure. With Mobx, you can read and write to your state, so it's impure. And also, they're both different in terms of how you write to state. With Redux, it requires actions. And so you have to fire an action for the reducer to know how to update or what to do to the state. Mobx, that's not necessarily true. Your observable data kind of acts like free slots. They can accept data from anywhere. So sure, you can fire an action, but you can also just simply do a simple reassignment in a component, and that'll be totally fine. And lastly, normalized versus nested. With Redux, typically it's recommended that you normalize your state. And that's because, again, Redux uses immutable data, and immutable data updates require all ancestors in the state tree to be copied and updated as well. So these new object references can cause Redux-connected UI components to re-render the UI, even though the state that component cares about didn't update. So you don't want deeply nested data, and so you typically are recommended to normalize it. Whereas Mobx, you can keep your state denormalized. And the reason is because, as I said, Mobx has the concept of computed values and these tracked functions. And so Mobx automatically kind of keeps track of what you care about. So if you have a bunch of users and your view only renders the active users, then it'll automatically update when the active users update and no other time. So you don't have to worry about nested data causing a UI component to re-render unnecessarily. I'm going to skip this one. Okay, so this is the fun part. we're going to do Battle of the State Management Libraries. So we have Dan Abramov on the left, and then we have Michael Westrate on the right. And what's going to happen is I'm going to go through different things. I'm going to ask you guys, if you guys care to shout out who you think wins in this category. So first, I'm going to start out with learning curve. Yeah, that's my opinion too. Again, it's an opinion. It's not hard truth, but I'll try to explain why I think so. With Mobx, you're working with a familiar paradigm. I think it doesn't force you to kind of learn and adapt to a new one. And again, also because it has more magic. Like, for example, it abstracts away a lot. It abstracts away the need to understand your view rendering logic, like computed values, observer classes, and auto-run functions. They're magical in the way that just accessing an observable within their scope subscribes them to changes. So this kind of magic makes it typically easier to learn, at least that's what I found. Whereas with Redux, you have to learn the whole functional way of doing stuff. And for people coming from either traditional object-oriented JavaScript backgrounds or Java backgrounds, it's typically a little bit harder to get up and running. So I would view the learning curves as this. With Mobx, it's pretty linear, and once you learn it, it doesn't get more complex over time. With Redux, I felt that the core concepts are pretty easy. You can even read the source code library in like 30 minutes. So that part is easy, but once you start building more complex applications, you have to learn things like how to normalize your state, how to use memoize selectors, how to use Redux Thunk. And so at that point, the learning curve kind of goes exponential, and so that's where people struggle, I think. Next thing, boilerplate. Who do you think wins? Yeah. This was an easy one. So again, because Mobx is more implicit, more magic, you typically write less code. It doesn't really require you to introduce new abstractions because things are built in. Like you don't need Redux Thunk, you don't need to normalize your state, so you don't need memoize selectors. So it typically just leads to less code. Whereas Redux, it's more explicit, and you need more special toolings because there's not as much magic happening. Developer tools, what do you guys say? Wow, you guys are good. Yeah, I would say Redux is definitely better on this one. Mobx does the job, it's fine, but I don't think it's hard. I think it's hard to compare against what we have with time travel debugging and Redux. Debuggability. Wow. You guys are good. You guys are on the same page as me. Yeah, I think I agree with that one. I think, as I said, because with Redux, or let me start with Mobx. So Mobx internals are just more complex and require you to understand how to model behavior on observable streams. So when you run into, at least I found that when I run into bugs with Mobx, it's harder to debug than Redux. And the magic of like the observer classes and computed values and auto-run functions, I think it just makes it a little bit harder. Whereas Redux, everything is pretty explicit. All changes are centralized. And I think this is a very incredible feature when it comes to debugging because you know exactly where to look when something changes. So, for example, with Redux, like if you have some bug that's coming up in your user-related state, you know all your user-related logic is right there in your reducer. Whereas Mobx, again, because your data acts like free slots, it can be updated by using an action, but it can also be updated directly in the view. So searching for that bug is a little bit harder. Predictability. What do you guys say? Wow. This is very similar to the previous one, and I'm going to use the same points. Again, because it's explicit, one-way, pure. Redux, I would say, is more predictable. And when your data is like free slots, like Mobx, I think it does destroy predictability in a pretty big way. Whereas like Redux was designed kind of with the flux paradigm in mind, and The idea of with Flux was like when you're given a slice of state, you know exactly where that data comes from. Maybe it's not designed to be the most performant or the most concise way of writing your code, but it is the most predictable in my opinion. Testability. The loner over there. Yeah, this was a tough one. I had to pick sides, but I think because Redux is more opinionated, it typically makes it easier to get more code coverage. And what I mean by that is, with Redux, you have your actions, and it just returns a plain object. So testing that action is just a matter of firing that action and make sure it returns that plain object. Then testing your reducer is a matter of creating a new state and an action and making sure that your reducer returns the new state if that action is fired. So you just copy and paste all these tests across all your actions and reducers, and like 80% of your code is covered already. Whereas with Mobx, if you're strict about it and you do use actions to mutate state, then yes, I think you can get decent testability there. But because, again, Mobx is not strict about that, if you're just mutating state directly in a non-click handler like this, which is totally possible, then testability just grows out of hand sometimes. Modularity. So this is a fun one because I'm trying to explain. Mobx definitely gives you modularity the object-oriented way. Like because of the whole distributed domain classes, it does give you that kind of modularity. But I think the one thing to remember is that with Redux, even though it's globally shared and it's not necessarily modular, I think sometimes we want modular code, but in the front end, it's inevitable that your components are going to want to share state. And so with Redux, it's almost like the global shareable state is good. And the modular state, when your application grows, it becomes a little more complicated. Like when you have so many different stores, coordinating across the stores and figuring out how do they share data, how do they reference each other, that becomes harder and harder over time, I think. So yes, Mobx does give you modularity the object-oriented way, but I can't say that, personally I would say I would prefer the globally shared way, but there's a lot of people who come from an object-oriented background who would prefer this modular way of writing code. Scalability and maintainability. Guys are Redux fans. Yeah, I would say Redux because of the whole functional, pure, strict order way of doing stuff. Whereas Mobx, because there's no strict order, it kind of doesn't give you that guarantee that everything's changing in a controlled way. And so in a large team, I think if changes can come from anywhere, then Mobx could cause maintenance problems over time. Community. Yeah, it goes through the roof. All right, so which do you choose, right? Is it set state? Is it Mobx? Is it Redux? Or is it something else altogether? All right, so I'm going to say start here. This is a mistake I made when I was learning React. I jumped right into React and Redux and tried to learn both of them at the same time. And I think it's because a lot of the community examples out there have Redux baked into it. And then I had to go back and learn the React the right way and just learn the React lifecycle methods, learn the React internal component state management. And honestly, it works really well when your state is hierarchical and sort of matches your component structure. So when your state kind of looks like this, you can neatly pass on your props, and it works just fine. So I would say start here, and only when you run into problems, like maybe you have set state soup everywhere and event handlers and everything, and it's going out of hand. And so the problems you would run into is, as you start to share more and more state across components, this is when the internal state management becomes difficult. Or when you start to see that your distant leaf components need access to state, that intermediate components don't need, and you're passing down props like 5 different levels, then maybe you should consider Mobx or Redux. So that's when we want to pull out our state from the components into an external library like Mobx or Redux. And that way, the individual leaf components can access and manipulate state on their own. So Mobx, I would say if your application, personally, this is what I think. I think if your application is a simpler application, you want to kind of rapidly prototype, it's a small team, I would say Mobx is probably the way to go because there's a lot less boilerplate, a lot less setup, the learning curve is easier, and you don't have to worry about maintainability, scalability with a small team as much because you guys can coordinate how to make updates and kind of have like your own protocol. That's what we did at Coinbase. It was a team of like 3 people, and so we had a defined way of how we wanted to use Mobx. But I think as a team grows, kind of keeping that in order becomes harder. So I think Redux typically I would prefer to use for more complex applications where you care about this maintainability, scalability, predictability, large team, and changing requirements. I think Flux is really good at being flexible and allowing you to scale an application by just adding a bunch of reducers and actions. But another way to think about how to choose the two is thinking about your update logic. So with Mobx, I think Mobx will just feel easier if you like modularity and a single domain class can encapsulate all its update logic. So what do I mean by that? So let's say you have a view and a user can buy something, and when they buy something, you need to update the UI in some way, you need to update your inventory in some way, and you need to update your bookkeeping store in some way. So what do you do with Mobx? One option might be you fire 3 actions, which is just, it gets a little complex. Or you might say, okay, I'm going to create some kind of controller or app service that handles manipulating all the 3 stores. This is when I think Redux just shines, when greater than one part of the state is affected by an action. That's because you can fire a single action, and all your update logic is encapsulated in that reducer. So maybe your UI reducer, inventory reducer, and bookkeeping reducer will all update to a single action. So when your update logic is more complex, I think Redux makes more sense. So overall, I think Mobx really works well when you're reacting to state changes because of its reactivity and sort of ability to give you that magical feel that it's just reacting. So things like real-time systems, dashboards, text editors, presentation software, and it's not as good for event-based systems, like where there's an event happening and multiple updates to state that need to happen. Whereas Redux, you're kind of thinking in terms of actions or events, and so I think it works better for like business applications, event-based systems, or like another example is game events that involve like a complex reaction, multiple parts of the UI need to change. And then the other question is like, do you use something else altogether? And the reason I picked these 2 libraries to talk about today is because I think they offer something very special for the front-end community in different ways. So one, we're realizing that referential transparency is super important for the front end, and that's why you're seeing a lot of these functional principles come back to the front end. And this is what Redux always gives you, right? You have your pure reducer functions, you have your immutable state, and so it gives you referential transparency there. Whereas Mobx, it sometimes gives you that. So you have, when you're deriving data off your observable, data, you use pure functions, which are your computed values, to derive that data. So in that sense, it is referentially transparent. But in the other way, when you're going from the event to the observable data mutation, it's not necessarily referentially transparent because, again, it kind of acts like free slots. But the thing that Mobx does give you is reactivity, whereas Redux doesn't necessarily give you that. So then when we think about it, like, what can we get when we actually combine these 2 different things, the concept of a reducer and the concept of an observable? And to that I say, see you in the future. This is actually something like what my talk at React Europe will be, so if you're interested, watch that. In conclusion, whichever one you choose, it's not an end game. There's no vendor lock-in, not framework specific. And I think it's relatively doable to go from Redux to Mobx or Mobx to Redux. I had to do it at Coinbase. We first built it in Redux, and then we had to move the whole thing to Mobx, and it was not as bad as I thought. Overall, I'd say pick the tool that makes you a happy developer.